Leviticus 21 and 22 really talk about leadership. When I was a student at Northern Baptist quite some time ago now, there were some people who left an entire estate to the church, to the college. It was worth several £1 million, and their motivation for doing this was if the church in the UK was going to survive and prosper, it would only do that if it had good leadership. And so they left their money in their will of this big estate, several £1 million, and they left it to the college to train future leaders. I wonder if we give enough importance to the whole idea of leadership today. The spiritual leaders in the nation of Israel were the priests. They were in charge of the sanctuary. They taught the people from the Bible. They offered the sacrifices of God's altar. They determined the will of God to the people. And apart from the ministry of the priests, Israel had no way to approach God. But the priests had to meet qualifications that God had given in order to belong to it, and they had to serve in according to his directions. These two chapters talk about personal conduct, physical characteristic, and professional concern. They had to meet God's approval. You might say there's a price to pay if you want to be a spiritual leader. That was certainly true then. Perhaps it's true for us today. So the first area they talk about in the chapters talk about in chapter 21 and the first 15 verses talks about personal conduct. The priests were to be examples to the rest of the nation. Unfortunately, this was often not the case. The important thing was that they remained ceremonial clean before the Lord, and we've talked about what could make you unclean in previous weeks. The high priest's sons, they were also had to meet the qualifications given by the Lord. Other Jews in the camp could plan weddings and funerals pretty much as they pleased, but God told the priests how to express their grief, how to select a wife, and he managed the manner of their grief. Any priest who shaved his head was who cut his body was acting like a heathen, so he was excluded. So there's this whole thing about personal conduct. There were very restrictions about who they could marry. All these qualifications and regulations, perhaps we want to say, don't apply to people today, but perhaps the principles are still important and applicable. If someone was to come forward for a role in leadership in our church, what sort of personal conduct do we think they should show? The second area in 21:16 to 24 is about physical characteristics. Everyone is born a sinner. There's no way around it. But our physical and moral defects aren't an obstacle to either salvation or service. When God invites the lost to be saved, he calls to the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame, according to Luke, the very people Jesus ministered to here on earth. And all believers can be living sacrifices for his glory, no matter what handicaps we might have. In the nation of Israel, however, God requires that the priests be free from defects and blemishes. Perhaps two reasons. One, the sacrifices that the people brought had to be perfect, and so it was only appropriate that those who offered the sacrifices also had to be without defect. Second, the priests were a sort of shadow, if you like, of the high priest Jesus who was to come, and there was and is no defect in him at all. A disqualified priest for some of these reasons was not treated like a second-class citizen. They couldn't serve at the altar or in the holy place, but they were still considered priests and were allowed to share with their families in the sacrificial meal. We're not sure, no one seems to be sure of all the meanings of all the Hebrew words for the defects named in this paragraph, but blind, lame, disfigured or deformed seem to summarise them. Tough time to live and stringent commands to be a priest. The third area it talks about is professional concern. It wasn't enough to just be a son of Aaron, not enough to be without physical defects. You also had to carry on the ministry in such a way that the Lord was pleased with him. The worshippers might look at the outward ritual, but God would look at someone's inner heart. Carelessness and professionalism at the altar would show itself in three ways. People would become unclean, they would perhaps have unqualified guests and offer unacceptable sacrifices. This sort of behaviour would show that the priest was putting himself above God and was more concerned about his reputation than his character. The name for this sort of sin is hypocrisy. It worried him that the people would know he was unclean, but it didn't worry him that he was defiling the sacred ministry for which God had set him apart. This was just like the Pharisees of Jesus' day. The faithful priest had to serve with honesty and courage in terms of serving God and himself. So suppose the priest asked, "Why should I honour and respect the sacrifice of God and the ministry he has given me?" The closing three verses of this chapter would perhaps answer that question. Number one, because these are God's commandments and they must be obeyed. God never commands anything that isn't the best for us. The second answer would be, this is the way we've glorified God's name. And the third would be that the Lord who commands also redeemed us from slavery, and he's the one who has set us apart to be his special people. We owe everything to him. Perhaps those answers are the motivation we need today, because certainly not just those of us who are ordained, but all of us who are called to be God's people today are one way or another all called into the priesthood and are all called to be leaders. I hope we'll find a few things to talk about.